This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk. I'm your host, Rob Port. My guest, Congressman Kelly Armstrong, and it has been a little bit of a wild ride as we have Arctic weather. We have people's lights not staying on. And Kelly, I know you've had a lot to say about that issue. Maybe that's where we could start our conversation today is the power outage. Everybody's calling them the Texas power outages. But the power outages affected a lot of people well outside of Texas and well outside of Texas's now famous or maybe infamous independent power grid. It impacted people here in North Dakota as well. How did it happen? I mean, as somebody like you, you work in public policy, you've worked in the energy industry. How does something like this happen?
Well, let's start with the first part. And by the way, we had a hearing last week in Energy and Commerce Subcommittee in Energy on decarbonizing the grid about 3 days after all of this happened. So that was pretty interesting. But I made that same point. Texas obviously came up a lot in that hearing, but I talked about North Dakota and how my old stopping grounds, Killdeer, North Dakota, was having rolling blackouts. But we'll start with the first part. One, I think everybody on both sides of the aisle, and this conversation goes farther than the grid, but recognizes that our grid needs to be modernized. We have to have more interoperability. We have to have more intraoperability, and grid infrastructure in general from North Dakota to Texas has been lacking in modernizing the infrastructure and keeping up with the infrastructure. So that's part of the issue. The other part of the issue is how different energies get on the grid. And, quite frankly, Texas was warned about this, but they weren't really Texas's grid failure was, the most likely scenario in any case was heat, right? If it was 115 degrees for 10 days straight, that's where their real warnings were. But it's just like any town, I guess, that gets a snowstorm. D.C. is a good example. They don't have the capabilities of dealing with it like we do in North Dakota. And there's real arguments why they shouldn't have 17,000 snowplows in the District of Columbia because their weather events happen every 5 years.
It's interesting because I had people we had a lot of object lessons in why we don't have a lot of excess capacity sitting around. I mean, people were asking me, how are we running out of hospital beds during COVID? It's even at the heights of COVID in North Dakota, we had a few hundred people in the hospital. I think a lot of people are assuming, well, why can't we make space for them? It's because hospitals, to keep costs low, don't have a lot of excess capacity sitting around, right? They don't have a lot of nurses just twiddling their thumbs or hospital beds just sitting, waiting for somebody to lay in them. They gauge, and so much like power grid, they gauge it for forecastable demand. And then when you have something that comes along that turns that on its head and creates a whole lot of extra demand, they're just not ready for it.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. We built a new hospital recently in Dickinson, and the old hospital, quite frankly, you could film an 80s horror movie in the place. But one of the reasons that when we were raising money to build this new hospital in Dickinson was how we deliver medical care. And one of the very first things was, listen, people don't spend 3, 4, 5 days in the hospital anymore for the vast majority of procedures. And our old hospital simply had too many beds and not enough modern medical technology. So you take that and you transpose across the entire state of North Dakota, and just by modernizing your medical facilities, you lose beds because we don't deliver healthcare the same way anymore.
So wind power has been a big fight in the context of the power outages, and it's fashionable now for people to say, well, wind's not to blame, and I understand why people, because the thing we have to remember is unexpectedly cold. I shouldn't even say unexpectedly. The fact that many Texas power sources were not prepared for cold weather is the reason why the lights went out. It knocked power. It was wind turbines. It was gas plants. The cold weather knocked them offline, and then demand went through the roof. So simultaneously, you have the cold weather taking power sources offline and demands going through the roof, and the result was blackouts. That's the primary thing. Wind is secondary to that in that you can't ask wind to produce more power. Everybody's saying, well, wind was meeting its expectations that's right, because expectations are basically nothing in the winter months because wind produces almost no energy in the winter months.
But a week before this happened in Texas, wind was producing about 29% of the power on the grid. While this all happened, it was producing 0%. And the policy associated around renewable energies is a huge factor in why this happened. And anybody who says it isn't paying attention. This is what I said in the committee the other day. So if wind's producing just under 30% of the power on the Texas grid a week earlier and producing 0% of the power on the grid when they have a weather emergency, I mean, the economics of energy production tell you that natural gas, coal, nuclear have to survive in an environment where combined they're producing 60% of the power. They have to survive economically so that when you need them to produce 99.9% of the power, they're available. And so if anybody says renewable policy isn't part of this isn't a huge factor in whether they're blackouts in Texas or blackouts in North Dakota, and load shedding and all of those different things, they're not paying attention. I mean, it's not baseload power.
Yeah. And imagine if you told a grocery store, hey, most of the time the organic food stand down the street that we're going to subsidize, and in some cases we're going to mandate that people use, they're going to have 60% of the market share. But we need you to keep products on your shelf to handle 100% of market demand when the organic market down the street closes because it's raining. That's essentially what we're asking power sources like coal and nuclear to do. You need to have the capacity ready to provide 100% of the grid's energy, but we're only going to, you still have to compete against these intermittent people who we're going to heavily subsidize and everything else, and you've got to sit in the back of the bus when they're producing power. That's what we've done, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Natural gas you can put in there too. Texas didn't actually have a lot of storage on natural gas. Now, natural gas saved Texas. I can show you charts that showed that. Natural gas's fundamental fault when it comes to nuclear or coal is it's an internationally traded commodity. Yeah. And we've seen the downsides of that over the last 5 days too.
Yeah, well, gas is a volatile market. There's just no getting around it.
Yeah.
Unlike coal, unlike nuclear. So when you talk about, you started this out saying we need to modernize the grid. What does that mean?
Well, it means, it's just like everything else. The United States used to be the best country in the world on infrastructure, and I don't think anybody thinks we are anymore. Whether it's, we have all these fights about pipelines. You and I have talked about that. But you think it's hard to permit a pipeline. Try permitting a high voltage transmission line through a community. We have gotten into this environmental and bureaucratic regulatory environment where putting infrastructure in the ground takes years and years and years. And because of that, the cost has gone up and up and up. And we have a ton of not in my backyard local jurisdictions about everything, right? Doesn't matter if it's a cloverleaf for a highway, high voltage transmission line, or a pipeline. And if we cannot get infrastructure in the ground because 1, it's expensive, 2, you keep getting sued, 3, in the case of a pipeline, 4 years after it's been running, you might shut it down. We're going to continue to see these problems because regardless of what kind of energy you're putting on the grid needs to be hardened and modernized from one end of this country to the other. And this is something we heard from Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, and liberals for 2 years straight on the Climate Crisis Committee. And it's just really, really interesting that we don't do more to streamline the permitting process, protect all of the environmental concerns, but also understand that our country relies on energy infrastructure in order to live our daily lives. Outside of water and sewer, Rob, I think that until the last couple of weeks, the thing that's taken for granted more by people in the general public, myself included, is you flip the light switch and the lights come on.
I was interviewing Senator Kramer last week, and I made that exact point. We are babied when it comes to this stuff, right? I mean, we just expect, like I go to sleep when we were having Arctic weather and it was getting down to 20, 30 below at night. I was going to sleep fully confident that my furnace was going to keep my house warm all night and that there wasn't going to be any outages, there weren't going to be any power outages. I wasn't even thinking of that stuff until obviously what happened. And I, luckily, our home here, we're on the meso power grid, so we didn't have any power outages, but we absolutely take it for granted. I heard somebody quip that the only time he was talking about politicians, but I think you can lump the general public in. The only time politicians care about power outages is when the lights go out. Then all of a sudden we start talking about the grid. And
well, that's actually true, but you'll be happy to know this is something I've been harping on for 2 years in Congress and even before that, because reliable and resilient energy is not an intellectual exercise in Western North Dakota. I mean, think if we had a week-long blackout 2-3 weeks ago. I mean, think of the weather in North Dakota, the extreme cold, and if we would have had a situation. I mean, it's been real bad in Texas, and they're not. I mean, like I said, it's Texas, so they're not prepared for this kind of weather event. But imagine if that would have happened in North Dakota 3 weeks ago.
I mean, what do I do? I mean, okay, so my furnace isn't working. I now have to keep it warm in my home. Even if I'm not in my home, I'm going to want to keep it warm because otherwise the pipes are going to freeze. And if the pipes freeze, then what happens? Well, that's a heck of a lot of damage to my house, or to my plumbing at the very least, which is going to cost thousands of dollars. How am I going to keep my house? Well, I don't know, probably try to find like generators. So I'm using gasoline, or maybe I'm trying to use propane heaters or something, which is not, you shouldn't be using those indoors. And also that's going to put more demand on natural gas if a lot of people are doing that. So, I mean, it's not a good look. So is it really just that we need to make it easier to build? Because that's the obvious thing. If you're going to modernize the grid, that's going to mean building transmission lines. That's going to mean building more substations. It's going to mean building all of that infrastructure that we're going to have
more
to go
pipelines.
More pipelines, natural gas pipelines specifically in this instance. Is it really just making it easier to do that stuff without getting, ending up, tied up in court by environmental lawyers who get paid to do nothing but tie people up in court?
That would be a big part of it, but we also have to have a longer and a more serious and a reasoned discussion about how much of your grid on a normal Tuesday in June should be intermittent power. I mean, we have to have that conversation. I mean, President Trump said it, and it's true. Wind works really well when you don't really need it, and when you really need it, it usually doesn't work at all.
That's the ridiculous thing, is there are times when wind energy has a negative price because we don't control when the wind is blowing, and a lot of times it's blowing when we don't really need the power that much. And so what happens is wind power, they end up literally have to pay to offload their power onto the grid. And then they can still make money because they have the production tax credit.
Well, and we keep hearing about we're going to increase these storage efficiencies. We're going to keep increasing efficiencies in wind and solar. But, I mean, the max a solar panel can turn photons into electrons is 33%. We're producing 25% right now. That's under the technology that exists. Wind is like 65%, and we're at like 43%. We're actually pretty efficient at how we produce this energy. So, I mean, this continued talk about, well, the efficiencies are going to increase. Tesla has a car battery factory in Nevada. It's the biggest one in the U.S. I think it's the biggest one in the world. It would take them 500 years to produce enough batteries to store 1 day's worth of U.S. electrical needs. I mean, we keep talking about how
assuming we could find all the materials we need to make those batteries. By the way,
250 tons of dirt moved to make one electric car battery.
Right.
I mean, first of all, we should talk about whether this is as clean as we pretend it is, because I don't think it is. It's just we outsource our guilt to other places in the world.
So that's the frustrating thing is, and by the way, I think Tesla cars are cool as hell. I don't have a thing against electric cars. I don't have a thing against wind turbines either. If they worked the way they're advertised to work, they just don't. We don't have the technology to support using wind turbines on the grid in the way we're trying to use them. We don't have that technology. That to me is the fundamental problem of this, and why we're talking about wind in the context of the Texas power outages is because wind is not ready. We've promoted it to the point where it exists on the grid. at levels that are far in excess of what's justified by the actual technology.
100%. And the other answer, which I've learned a lot out in D.C., which really drives me nuts because of where I'm from, they really don't want wind farms in Martha's Vineyard. Yeah. They want them from one end of North Dakota to the other. I mean, and solar panels. And they've been a great economic, help to communities in North Dakota. And I mean, from tax revenue to all of that. But I've said this from the beginning, and I'll say it to the end. Reliable grid infrastructure and reliable energy should not be a local economic issue. It just shouldn't. They try and compare it to oil and natural gas, and it's not the same thing. One, because it's intermittent power, and two, it's because, that and the argument that the free market is what's killing coal. Well, I don't know what's a free market about allowing one certain source of energy to, one, have primacy on the grid, and two, to sell it for less than it costs to produce. There's nothing free market about that. No. That's just not true. That's a regulatory
If the government comes in, I mean, some state governments have mandated like green energy. They have green energy mandates, right? I mean, that's not a free market where they're just saying you have to buy a certain percentage of your groceries from this particular store. That's not a free market. Also, we're going to give
shareholders are mandating it.
Right. We're going to give this particular type of energy a massive subsidy and not that energy. And then when that other energy that's not getting the subsidy starts to die, we're going to say, oh, it's the free market at work. No, it's not. It's politics. And that's unfortunate.
That's a huge reason why natural gas has thrived, right? Because renewables get primacy on the grid. Well, two reasons. One, the Bakken, the Permian are real big reasons why
we've opened up huge reserves of natural gas. Yeah.
But secondly, natural gas turbines can ramp up and ramp down a lot easier than nuclear or coal. So when you're giving primacy for 30% of your grid energy to renewables, it's very difficult when those go offline for a coal plant to scale up or a nuclear plant to scale up. It's much easier for a natural gas plant to scale up and scale down. So it's not just that we give them the subsidy economically, we also give them, favored nation status on the grid, which is a real problem for other energy sources.
When's the production tax credit going to go away? Because to me, that's a big driver of a lot of this problem. Yeah, well, it seems to me that the wind industry has been telling us that they don't need the PTC for like a decade now, and yet it's still here and it's still getting renewed every year very quietly. It gets stuck into some end of the year bill, and then boom, we have another year of the production tax credit, which by the way allows them. I mean, every new project this year that the PTC is in place, if you start the project, once it's qualified for the PTC, they get to collect it for a decade, right? So the moral hazard on this is bigger than maybe people realize.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I said this the other day in the hearing, and I'll say it here too. Whenever we have a bill in the North Dakota legislature that affects wind negatively, the reason every wind lobbyist from one end of the country to the other flies into Bismarck isn't because they care about the environment. If anybody believes that, they're not paying attention. They do it because there's a huge economic incentive to do this. And every year we extend it in what we call our omnibus bill. And every year I vote against it. I mostly vote against it because I come from a place where a deal is a deal. You've agreed to let it sunset, and then after
if you're saying publicly you don't need it, then you don't get away with privately saying, oh no, renew it again.
Well, and I'm not part of those conversations. It very well may be that they just stay out of it because they know their liberal allies in D.C. are going to put it in whether they weigh in or not. I mean, but it should have been gone 2 years ago, and it keeps getting extended for an extra year here every year. And I hope people are, at least understanding how important it is to have electricity in your house and how, in a lot of ways, this is held together with duct tape and silly putty.
Well, and not just in your house, but when you connect to your internet, I mean, you're connecting to computers across the country and across the world, server farms or what have you, that also use electricity. And if you want to use Tesla, which, by the way, one day I would like to own a Tesla because, again, the computer nerd in me thinks they're cool as hell, right? I think that'd be awesome. There's a reason why the lignite Energy Council in North Dakota owns a Tesla car because they want people to use more electricity. Electricity unlocks a world for us that is amazing. And we could do all sorts of amazing things, but it's predicated on us being able to produce the electricity to power it. And it's like we're heading in two divergent directions. We're having people saying, buy Teslas and use electric cars, but also let's hamstring our ability to produce electricity reliably. This makes no sense.
None. And that's before we talk about we don't have enough rare earth metals in the world to scale up the U.S. fleet from 1% to 10% electric cars. If you're driving from Grand Forks, North Dakota to Cheyenne, Wyoming in a Tesla, that becomes a pretty interesting endeavor. We have infrastructure that we have to build all across the highway system. Utilities will want to play in that. A lot of people in D.C. fill their electric cars at the post office. Are we now having, government competing with a town of 600 people? In a town of 600 people, what's the anchor business? It's a gas station. It's a convenience store, right?
Yep.
And it's part of who the community is. They sponsor a baseball team. They help out the high school. They do those things. And so how are we going to deploy the supporting infrastructure from Grand Forks to Cheyenne? What is the plan for that? Because nobody's told me what it is. And I pay attention, and I'm on the committee's jurisdiction, and I ask these questions all the time.
Yeah.
We talk about President Biden fleeting up the federal fleet. Well, do you know how much a long-haul truck that's electric is going to weigh? The batteries are unbelievably heavy. What does that do for load weights? What does that do to
the wear and tear on our roads? That's problematic.
What's the carbon footprint of having to replace a county highway every 3 years instead of every 20?
And then there's the reality that driving a Tesla in Southern California, where it never gets that cold, is much different than trying to fire one up in January and drive to Fargo.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You're even at maximum ranges. From where I live in Minot to Fargo is probably at the maximum range, at or near the maximum range for most electric vehicles under optimal conditions. What does that look like when it's 20 below?
Yeah, and it takes an incredibly long time to charge these as well. One of the reasons the Lignite Energy Council likes them is because they want them to plug them in at night, and it solves some of their duck curve problems.
Right.
But then my question is, why do we have a duck curve?
Well, there's that as well. So let's talk about
the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't blow.
Yeah, well, that's part of the problem. So I was looking. You have a press release that came out just before we began our interview. It's you joining bipartisan effort to spur development of carbon capture technology, 45Q tax credit. Tell me about what is this?
Yeah, the short version, without getting into the weeds of it, is that it makes 45Q more accessible, extends the deadline, allows it for uses like Project Tundra, hopefully allows it for uses like enhanced oil recovery and flooding of, those types of issues. But again, this is an issue, that we've, talked about in the energy or in the climate crisis. I didn't name the committee, the climate crisis subcommittee, and even, Democrat witnesses, the good ones, tell you the world's going to burn more coal next year than it did last year. So we need to continue to develop these types. These types of programs are what's going to help us reduce our carbonization of the atmosphere and also keep reliable energy available and competitive in the marketplace.
Well, that's one of the things that I think people don't understand is I think they view coal-fired electricity as a static technology, as if it was the same as it was 100 years ago. And it's just not. It's not. They've made all sorts of amazing advancements. They've solved the sulfur dioxide issue. They've solved mercury issues. They've addressed these issues. It has been an evolving technology that has improved continuously and can still improve. People forget about that. Coal is not static. We can do coal better even than we are now, which is still an entire universe better than we were doing even 50 years ago.
Yeah, and in the last 20 years, the technology to produce electricity hasn't really changed that much. It's all environmental tech, right? As technology has increased and we are more efficient at burning coal, the cost of burning coal has also gone up. Well, that's not because it costs more to make electricity out of coal. It's because of the environmental regulatory environment we have put on coal. I'm not here to debate it. It's here, and it's going to continue to be here. So this type of technology allows a very both reliable in being able to produce it and cost of production, energy source to compete in a marketplace where we are trying to reduce our carbon impact.
People, I hear a lot of people when we start talking about 45Q, they're like, oh, I thought you conservatives were against subsidies. And to me, this is a very distinct issue. There's one thing to subsidize production, which is what the PTC is when we talk about wind energy, where they're literally just getting a check from the government for producing wind energy. That is a different thing than subsidizing what amounts to research, right? Where we're saying we are going to research how to capture carbon, which has applications obviously for the coal industry, but potentially applications far outside of the coal industry as well.
Absolutely. And the other answer is you have to go back to why this started. And this is one of my fights natural gas and cheap natural gas is a big reason why coal has had problems. We talked about that earlier. But we have to start from the beginning of the Obama administration, where they forced regulations on coal mines and coal plants that the cost of compliance, the technology didn't exist. Like, they legitimately put a regulatory regime in with no means of meeting it. So everybody wants to start every new discussion at zero, and that's one of our problems that we deal with in politics a lot. But you can't start that conversation at zero. You have to start it based on why they are in this place. And the reason they're in this place, like I said, isn't because it's ever been more expensive to produce energy from coal. It is more expensive because of government regulation. And some of that regulation is good. Some of that regulation is unrealistic. We can talk about all of that.
Some of it, let's be honest, was not formulated to cleanly, more safely or more cleanly produce coal power, but was to put coal out of business. It was formulated
to shut them down.
Right.
Yes, 100%. You don't have to go very far. Go to West Virginia and look at how West Virginia used to be a blue state and is now a red state. And it has Hillary Clinton made one bad comment. Barack Obama had made a couple bad comments. And when your entire livelihood of your communities is based on certain economic drivers, it doesn't take very long to figure out why it switched.
One of the things, I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because I don't want to say that the economic impact of some of these things is unimportant, because it is, right? I mean, if Coal Creek Station shuts down, as it's scheduled to, there are entire communities in central North Dakota that are going to die. People are going to move away. Schools are going to close. Businesses are going to close. These places are going to become essentially ghost towns, because there's just nothing to keep people there anymore. If you're living in a community like that, you can't. There's not just another industry waiting to hire you up. So that's a problem. But yet, if Coal Creek was shutting down because we invented some new way, and it's not wind or anything like that. But if we had invented an alternative to coal that worked, and thus the coal that would just be, to me, I would be sad. But to me, that's the creative destruction of the free market. We found something better. We're producing something better. Life goes on. So I don't want to pit it like we're just clinging to coal because we want to keep people in Beulah working. People in Beulah working is important, don't get me wrong, but we're clinging to coal because it works, and it works better than what the alternatives are being proposed. That, I think, that sometimes gets lost in some of our debates about this stuff.
And I'm clinging to it, natural gas and small-scale nuclear, for this reason, because I really believe this. 15 years from now, we will be burning as much natural gas and as much coal as we are right now. But think of the destruction we can cause in Beulah, in Hazen, in Washburn in the process. And the reason I tell you that is that's what's going on in Germany. They started their clean power plan 12 years ago. They're burning more coal now than when they started their program. Yeah. And there's a lot of each situation's unique, right? They have a Vladimir Putin problem, who they don't want to. They don't want to rely on him solely for their energy. But their gas, I just believe that, and we don't. One thing we don't want, and it doesn't matter if it's in the oil industry, the coal industry, or any industry right now, is more consolidation. these industries thrive from smaller business, smaller operations, because those are the ones who innovate, right?
Right.
Because they have to compete in the marketplace anyway. So all I think we're doing is destroying communities, destroying companies, and 15 years from now, under any technology that I have been briefed on, we're going to burn more coal and more natural gas.
Well, because demand
They're going to be part of our future. They're going to be part of our future energy source. They're not the enemy. They're part of the solution.
Because demand is not static either. Demand is going to keep going up. People are, and I'm not necessarily even like electric cars, but the number of computers, the number of devices people have in their homes, the number of, I have a charging station in my home, and all the tablets and electronic devices that I'm charging for myself and my kids is, I look at it, it's under the pile of it, like, where did this come from? So, anyway, that's all important to consider. It's very, very frustrating. Hopefully we'll start to see some return to sanity on this. But I'm not hopeful when we look at the reaction to the Texas thing, where people started talking about wind, and immediately there was this reaction in the news media where it's not wind. No, it's we had all these explainers from these from Vox and some of these other sources, like, smarmily explaining to us how it couldn't wind, intermittent energy couldn't possibly be the problem with grid resiliency. And it's just frustrating. It's you want to talk about fake news? There's some fake news right there.
Yeah, and it's whenever one of these things happens, immediately what happens is, immediately, fossil fuel people said it's all wind's fault. Immediately, the left said it's all Texas's fault, and it needs more regulation, more federal regulation. And the reality of it is, it is very much this was the coincidence of a real bad weather event that lasted from, North Dakota to Texas, real bad policy, and real bad lack of maintenance of infrastructure. Those are the three things that, caused this. And all of them are to blame in some degree or another. But, you're never going to get me to concede that when 30% of your energy is intermittent energy on a grid system, that you can keep increasing that without sacrificing reliability and resiliency. And I think you do. And I think we need to be very, very aware of that.
Let's switch gears and talk about national politics right now. One thing, and I know that you and I probably diverge in our viewpoints on Donald Trump, but setting policy aside, for how is it working with the Biden administration so far?
Well, I don't think well. I think they have, 51 executive orders, none of which I think that people in North Dakota are overly fond of. I read an article, I don't even know where it's, so already, moderate senators in the House feel like or in the Senate, moderate Republicans feel like they've been left behind. And people, the take on it is that Biden's willing to cut a deal, but his staff isn't. And so we're going to see it now in a $1.9 trillion bill that we're going to pass out of the House sometime this week. And the real danger to that bill passing or not is a fight on the Democratic side on a $15 minimum wage bill. For those that know how the House works, we're basically spectators right now in the Republican Party. So if they get to some working of bipartisanship, which they keep promising and not delivering on, maybe we can figure out some things like grid infrastructure and overall infrastructure over the next 2 years. But I have seen nothing in over a month that allows me to believe that anybody's going to tack towards that direction.
That's frustrating. Do you think, right before we began the interview, I was talking a little bit about some of the bills. I was writing a column about a bill in the state legislature about insulin prices, and you used to serve in the state Senate, so we were chatting a little bit about that, and you were saying that you don't blame states like North Dakota for tackling issues like insulin prices, which are obviously, insulin prices are an issue that's a lot bigger than the scope of what the North Dakota legislature can do. Or, there was another bill addressing, the sort of monopolistic nature of our app stores on our smartphones, which ultimately failed. But again, your point was, well, state legislatures are feeling like they have to take this stuff on because Congress doesn't do anything. And I think you're right. And I think another product of that is you have presidents who issue just flurries of executive orders. I wasn't comfortable. I'm not comfortable with Biden's executive orders. I wasn't that comfortable with Trump's executive orders. I wasn't comfortable with Barack Obama's. I mean, going back to George W. Bush, it just seems Congress is dysfunctional and doesn't do their job. And then to fill that power vacuum, you have presidents acting unilaterally. Do you agree? Is that a problem? And how does Congress fix it?
I'll give you a perfect example. So we're marking up the $1.9 trillion bill in energy and commerce. And one of my colleagues on the Republican side offers an amendment to the bill on telehealth. Telehealth is the one shining star that has occurred over the last year.
Yeah.
Not a lot good has happened in the last year. Telehealth and our advancements in how we deliver healthcare in a very, very adverse environment has every stakeholder up and down the chain of delivery of medicine in favor of making these. Mostly it was removing regulatory burdens and making them permanent. Everybody, Democrats, Republicans, insurance, doctors, local healthcare facilities, patients, everybody loves it. So we offered an amendment to make it permanent on the $1.9 trillion bill. And every Democrat on the committee is like, yes, this is absolutely a great idea, but we can't put it in this bill. And I actually said that. I said, this is why people hate Congress. Because we all know this is a good idea. We have a vehicle to move this policy forward, and you will not allow it onto the bill because what has happened is, particularly that I've seen in the Democratic leadership, and I've seen it in criminal justice a lot, reform, they get all their outside stakeholders who they need to get elected, right? These are, whatever groups they are, to agree on a product before we ever have a debate. And so they are, they just absolutely get a mandate from leadership that you will not change one word in this bill. So this is an example. Everybody agrees it's great policy. Everybody agrees we have a vehicle to move it, but we can't do it. That's why people hate Congress. And that's why you're seeing state legislatures like North Dakota take on insulin, take on big tech. Those types of issues. The problem is like I said, I appreciate their willingness to try that, and I'm a small states conservative Republican, but there are certain things that the federal government has to do. And those are a couple examples.
There's a reason why the Constitution gives Congress the ability, even though Congress has frequently abused it, gives Congress to regulate interstate commerce. There are some issues, some markets that are so large, it really doesn't make a lot of sense for states. In the same way that we don't necessarily want patchworks of in some areas, right? I'm a states' rights guy too, but some issues are just. They need Congress. We have Congress for a reason, and they need Congress, but Congress doesn't act or acts in a way that's frustrating. If we could tack to the philosophical here for a moment, how much of that problem where people just they come in and they already have written down exactly what they want and they're not going to deviate from that at all, and then because nobody wants to compromise, nothing ever gets done. How much of that is the fault of the voters? Because I know for years I've been hearing people, and I've said it too, and I've started to think about it more. People saying, well, we got to send somebody to Washington with a stiff spine, and we don't want them to compromise. And there's more scrutiny on politicians, right? You don't have to turn C-SPAN on your television anymore. You can stream it on your smartphone. You can, watch this stuff play out in real time. The average citizen has easier access to draft bills or the progress of a piece of legislation, to the speeches on the floor, to committee hearings, to all of that, than any other time before in history. And we seem to be using all that scrutiny to tell our elected leaders, don't ever compromise on anything. And then what we get is gridlock and a power vacuum that's filled with a lot of bad policy. To me, well, I think one of the problems, and this is what annoys me so much when Jim Shaw decides to write about gerrymandering in North Dakota, which is just a ridiculous argument. But just absolutely, it makes no sense. If you want to talk about gerrymandering, show me an example of gerrymandering in North Dakota. That's what I keep asking these people. Show me an example where this has been done in an untoward way.
And that's exactly right. But I think it is an issue at the federal level, right? Every 2 years, there's 50 congressional seats out of 435 that are really in play. So we've created these really, really safe blue districts. We've created these really, really safe red districts. And every one of those members, I mean, this is what I always tell people, like, against who want term limits, like they want Speaker Pelosi gone. I'm like, that's fine, but you're going to replace her with somebody more liberal. Yeah. I mean, that's just the nature of her district. I mean, and at the same time, you're going to hurt small states and good legislators that have learned to operate in some of these other environments. But, you know, that's part of the issue. There are just way too many people in, I mean, and I've said this, I'm part of, and, you know, in some degree or another, North Dakota's a little bit like this. If MSNBC is beating me up for 48 hours straight, you think I'd go up or down in popularity in North Dakota?
Probably
I mean, as a
up.
whole.
Yeah, probably up.
But if I'm getting beat up by Tucker and Sean Hannity, I'm gonna start. You know, you have to. I mean, that's just the political reality of a lot of districts, and it's just become a place where if you want to do, 3-minute Fox hit, it's a great place to be. Regardless of what you feel about the guy and how all of this works, reading Rob Portman's reason for not running again is pretty important. I mean, you don't have to agree with everything he says to understand that he's like, there's just not a lot of room anymore to do real serious policy out here. And we have to figure out a way to get back to it. And a first step with that, by the way, I was with you. I was on Judiciary when we were talking about executive power under the Trump administration. And I said that then. I mean, we have ceded way too much power to the executive branch.
Yeah, although everybody seems to be in favor of that when they control the executive branch. But the great lesson in politics that nobody ever seems to learn is that it's cyclical. I think I wrote a column where I remember when Barack Obama won, and I think James Carville wrote a whole book, and it was, I'm forgetting the title now, but it was something like the 100-year Democratic majority. And 2 years into Barack Obama's term in office, the Democrats lost the House. So it's just people, we even people who work in politics for a living forget that there are no permanent majorities, and you need to craft the protections and the limitations on these powers and these offices in a way. You almost need to write the laws and write the policy, assuming that somebody you don't, as if you were writing them for somebody you didn't like. Right? I mean, if you're a Democrat, you should want restraints on executive power to be exactly the way you'd want them when Donald Trump is in office. And for conservatives, you should want them crafted in a way that when Barack Obama's in office. That's how we should approach this stuff. But we don't. It's all just we're governing for the moment, and then we don't get anywhere.
Do you think Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer regretted changing how we use the filibuster on judges? I think they probably did.
I think by the time Brett Kavanaugh was up there, I'm certain they did.
Yeah, McConnell didn't invent that.
No.
Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid invented it. That's the truth. And then we used it against them. You're exactly right. And you know, it's why Joe Manchin has become, you know, the most powerful guy in D.C. right now.
Yeah. Well, it shouldn't be that way. All due respect to Joe Manchin, who I respect in a lot of ways on principle, disagree on a lot of policy, but no one person should have that much power. And it's just...
Well, when you have a 50-50 Senate, every one person has power on every single issue.
That's
it's
true.
Just a matter of which one they care about.
And the executive branch has some power too, unfortunately, when the vice president can vote to break ties. So
well, that's the politically. I mean, and we were talking about executive orders and all of that. One of the things is it's a politically perverse incentive for them because they can actually create action immediately, right?
Yeah.
Even if Congress functions, it doesn't work quickly.
No.
And so they have in this digital age where everybody is more worried about being first than accurate. It just sets up, and how we develop policy out of this environment is going to have to be. I mean, we're going to have to talk to it. Now, the nice thing is we have so many different ways to reach our constituents, you know, and we have different ways to tell them why a lot of this stuff sounds good but isn't good. The problem is we have collective attention spans of fruit flies, right? There's a reason you run 30-second commercials. If it takes me 3.5 to 4 minutes to explain something, we have to figure out a way to engage people and listen to the whole thing, because the 30-second bit against it's easy to write. You know, the convergence of good policy and good politics doesn't happen as often as we would like. And we have to, and we just have to keep moving forward.
For all I rail about social media and everything, I got my start in this business as a blogger. Something that, 20 years before would not have even been possible. So I owe my career to it in many ways. It's just that the way that the pressures of social media and this, what I think is probably the most populist age in American history, just as a practical, not the ideological sort of populism, but just sort of the governance by the mob of the very sort of thing that our founders intended to protect our form of government against, because we're so in the thrall of Facebook and Twitter, and we're so afraid of getting steamrolled on there. It's driving a lot of policy decisions that aren't necessarily great. But we'll maybe have to dig into that another time. Pitchers and catchers are in camp. Kelly, you excited?
I am. I'm really excited. Of course, my Mets had a whole new different issue, and with a member with a free agent having to apologize for not coming to New York, and all kinds of different issues. And
because you're talking about Trevor Bauer, and I'll be honest with you, as a Yankees fan, also in the New York, I was kind of interested to see what happened to Trevor Bauer in the New York media market. Because I don't know how much good baseball there would have been, but man, there would have been a lot of good tabloid coverage.
Yeah, but I also think he handled that situation very well.
So?
His apology. I mean, sometimes apologies are apologies, right? And sometimes they're genuine, and I believe his was really genuine.
Yeah.
And it was, this is the other dangers of social media, and this is something we have to worry about in our office. You have stuff pre-baked in, so you can be first, right?
Right.
You write these releases, and then all of a sudden something goes differly, and somebody sends out the wrong release.
In my business, we call that being overtaken by events. I've written, I'm not going to mention the situation, but I have written some columns and headlines, and it's scheduled to be published, and then all of a sudden something happens in the world, and suddenly what I wrote takes on a completely different, look, because people I think I just type the column and then it appears magically online, and it doesn't. Like, there's a process that has to go through. There's a delay between when I turn it in, particularly if it's going to run in print as well. There's a delay between when I write it and when it runs in print. And I have had situations where things have happened in the world, and suddenly I'm frantically getting in touch with an editor. Let me edit this, or let's not run this quite yet, because holy cow, I'm going to look terrible if that runs.
How would you like to have been a local Seattle baseball, somebody covering baseball earlier this week?
Well, no
anything
kidding.
You had written in advance wasn't going to be what anybody was.
I feel like the
about.
Players Union owes that guy. They should send him a fruit basket or something, because he just admitted basically to manipulating service time for players, and I feel like that's going to be an issue going forward.
How do you think Kyle Seager is going to like this season? It's just ridiculous.
It is.
It's people are so tone deaf, and it's going to cause real problems in a town that's actually a pretty damn good baseball town.
Well, it is. I say that as a former Alaskan, right? That was the Alaska, even though we're like 1,000 miles from Seattle. That was the Alaska hometown team, right? It was the Seattle Mariners. But
but again, why does he still have his job? I mean,
he was fired.
I'm not in.
I'm pretty sure he resigned, or he resigned or was fired.
Oh, okay.
Maybe amounts to the same thing. But I think he's out. Yeah. What was his name? Kevin something. I'm forgetting.
Yeah.
President of Seattle Mariners.
Yeah. I mean, it's terrible. And I like him. I like Kyle Seager. I loved it when Ichiro was there. Obviously, Junior was there. King Felix had the worst record in the history of the best Cy Young season ever. It's a great baseball town. Plus, we got a North Dakota guy. Oh, no, he's for the Diamondbacks. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Going up there. So we've got a lot of different issues. We like Seattle. We want every one of those towns to survive.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, now that we've finished the baseball section of the podcast, I will sign off.
This is for all the baseball fans. They have to wait to the very end.
Wait till the end. Well, that's what you do. You put the base. That's what the grocery stores put the stuff you need in the back. So you got to walk by all the stuff you don't need first. That's what we do for the baseball fans on this podcast. Kelly, thanks for your time.
By the way, absolutely. Sometime we should talk about that, because small companies are really starting to get into, advertising restrictions and why they're not allowed to compete against big companies because of placement in grocery stores. And I'm not sure regulation is the answer. I think me. I hesitate to think that's a good idea, but it's a really interesting read, and it's just how we economically interact with the digital world right now, and it's pretty interesting.
Well, like you, I believe in competition, and I look at. I mean, I work in an industry right now that has been has been hurt very badly by Facebook and Google's, just to name two, dominance of the online ad market. Our ability,
Yep.
I mean, the reason why a lot of companies like mine are going back to a subscriber model, which by the way, I think is good and healthy for a lot of reasons. I know it annoys, a lot of people in the public, but I think it's a healthy thing to sort of retreat from the level of reliance we had. I say this as somebody I have absolutely no say in these. These are all way above my pay grade at Forum Communications Company. I don't have any say in any of this. But just as a bystander, I think it's better for us to rely on subscriber revenue as opposed to advertising revenue. But what Facebook and Google have done to that market, dominating it, and really is it's not it's a duopoly, I guess, if you're just talking about those two companies. But it's not a good. I don't think it's a good thing that serves our society well.
I couldn't agree more, and I actually think that's where there's the ad lawsuit between Google and Facebook, and it's not getting near the attention a lot of the other big tech stuff is. But I actually think that's where they get them eventually, and I think they need to.
Yeah, I agree. Kelly, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob.